Good morning, church. My name is Alexander Steadman, Alex Steadman. I've been here at First Church since November of last year, and very early on, Kirsty did recognize a call to ministry in me, and she has been working to empower and guide me. I could not be more grateful for Pastor Kirsty, Pastor Katie, and the entire staff and congregation of First United Methodist Church. In my short time here, you all have made a massive impact in my life and have helped keep me on the rails and continuing in faithful anticipation despite everything that has derailed me. Today, though, we're here to continue our sermon series on the effects of the fruit of the Spirit. Now, these fruits are the results of the pruning effect in our lives, the results of leaning into what God has for us and allowing ourselves to be shaped, to be called, and to be guided. I have been blessed with the opportunity to speak to you today about gentleness. Gentleness is that quiet and persistent voice of calm that we all need, especially in critical events like those we've seen in the past days, weeks, and months. Events that spark discord among the closest of friends. Events that can and do break friendships, cause some to weep in despair and pain, and others to whoop and holler in ultimate joy. Events that still, with almost 250 years of history, cause many of us to feel that the promises made to us by those sent to represent us have fallen flat and even betrayed us. Events that lead to painful arguments of who's right and who's wrong, and refuse to acknowledge even the idea of some sort of middle ground, as if we know all the answers ourselves. All of us have our opinions, and that's a great thing. It's good to have opinions. But what happens when our opinions clash with someone else's opinions? How many of you have ever gotten into a political, economic, or religious argument with anyone at all ever in your entire life? I will tell you, there have been many. Many of these arguments, though, may have been well in the past. Maybe you've worked through them, maybe we haven't, and maybe we just don't even talk to these people anymore. But we have spent the last 2 years in relative isolation from each other. During these quarantine times, or quarantimes, we unknowingly adjusted to being by ourselves and worrying about how to get through each day. It pulled us into ourselves, locked us out from our friendships and relationships. And all this leads us to now, the new normal that we are still trying to figure out. We are still trying to figure out how to interact with people again in a unified way that involves more than just what happens within our own personal spaces. As a result, there's an increase in anger, an increase in conflict, yelling matches between people who used to be close friends over anything and everything. How are we supposed to be gentle in a world that seems so hell-bent on making us lose? Even though it seems like it doesn't make any sense at all, we are still called to gentleness. Church, we are called to actively involve ourselves in each other's lives. We are called to do this despite any differences that we may have. We are called to it even if we know in the very core of our being that it's going to be rejected. We are called to bear each other's burdens in this way, to treat each other with gentleness, holding each other so we don't break under the weight of the world, strengthening each other so that we can withstand the onslaught of reality. And this must happen regardless of the traits and divisions that keep us with our hands around each other's necks rather than our arms around each other's shoulders. Where there is conflict, where there is pain, where there is division, fights, arguments, this is where we are called to hold each other with gentleness. But what even is this gentleness thing? How does it work? Let's explore this together. Something we've done in this series so far is to have a working definition of the fruit that we're talking about. So, what is the definition of gentleness? My guess is that every single one of you has in your head right now how you would define gentleness. You have a picture of it. But like me, if you were asked directly to define it, you might freeze up a little bit. I mean, of course we know what gentleness is. Isn't it just obvious? But when we finally figure out the verbiage to use, the words to use to help define gentleness, we start seeing that there's a wide variety of experiences, and these lead to wide-spreading, alternating definitions of gentleness. On our Wednesday classes here at First are a critical part of the sermon development and a critical part of creating good relationships with each other. So when I asked the class, what does gentleness mean? It wasn't that I didn't know the answer, I didn't know the definition, or didn't know what it was. It was that I needed the input of this community. I needed to see the breadth of experience that I don't have. And those experiences came out in force. One person related it to grace and mercy, being tender with one's own self and with others. Another person described it as a soft and tender touch, like holding a delicate object with the intention of giving it back. And this prompted a third person to pop up with the phrase, handle with care. Handle with care. 3 simple words that do an amazing amount of work. And there's way more under the surface of those 3 words than we may initially think. These 3 words tell us that there is something fragile or delicate involved. It tells us that something is important, that something has a large amount of inherent value and worth, that it's something good, that it's something to be cared for, that it has to be a priority. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not terribly strong. I can break pasta in half when I'm making dinner, but you hand me a crescent wrench and ask me to bend it in half, I can promise you that will never happen. My hands will break before that thing even moves. Still, with the strength that I do have, if I handle it wrong, would it be incredibly easy for me to break a porcelain vase, a light bulb, a crystal glass, a wilting flower that needed some water? What about a person's spirit? What about a person's soul? In the book of James, the author goes into great detail about how strong our tongues are, how strong our words are. Strong like a rudder, a small piece that's used to change the direction of a massive ship. Strong like a spark, which, as we have seen far too many times in recent years, can cause massive devastation. Handle with care. We have strength that we don't realize. We have power that we don't realize. And with this power and strength comes great responsibility. In our gospel reading today, we can see the gentleness effect in play. And to be completely honest with you, some of it is very easy to miss, very easy to gloss over. When reading it, there's a key phrase that, again, is just 3 words that is so easy to gloss over. That phrase is, yet know this. And the key word there is yet. As in, hold on, there's still something else happening. What is going on here? In this passage, Jesus is telling his followers, now keep in mind, church, that is us. We are the followers of Christ. So when he's talking to his followers, he's talking to us. He's telling his followers how to go out into the world and how to share the good news. He's calling us to go out and use our gifts, our goodness, our imago Dei, our prayers, presence, service, gifts, and witness to lift each other up and not tear each other down. He's telling them that when they go out, they will inevitably face conflict. And when they face that conflict, when we face that conflict, let those people be who they are. Let them be where they are. Leave if you have to. Kick the dirt of their town off your boots if you have to. But under any circumstance, make sure that they know that the kingdom of God is here for them, that the church is here for them, that we here at First United Methodist Church in Lincoln, Nebraska, are a place where those who are struggling can go for hope and for help, that our doors are always open, that our tables always have food on them, and that our shoulders are available to help carry the load. This is gentleness, church. This is gentleness, to be ready to carry the load, to actually carry the load for anyone and everyone that needs it. Now, we all have different gifts, different ways to work within our community to do this. And this is why we have Class 301, to help identify those gifts that we have and to see how we can use them to do gentleness in our community, to help build our church to be a presence and a force of gentleness. And Jesus himself talks about this in the book of Luke. Now, one thing to remember is that Jesus quite often talked in stories, which I love. So let's take a look at one of these stories real quick. So imagine there's a very, very rich man, and he's got a huge house, a huge table, lots and lots of food, and he wants to host this big banquet. So he sends invitations out to all his neighbors and friends, invites them all to this big fancy banquet. When the time comes, he gets excuses rather than attendance. One guy says, "Oh, my brother just got married, so I've got to go to that thing." And another one says, "Oh, I just got this new tractor, got to try it out a little bit first. I can't go to your party." And so, yeah, he's a little bit upset. He's a little bit upset that all his friends aren't coming to his party. But what does he do? He does not uninvite them. He does not rescind their invitation. Instead, what he does is he tells his servant to go out into the city streets and invite everyone and anyone, everybody and anyone in the city, even the despised, those who were spit upon, those who were hated, those who were reviled, the ones who society was totally fine with completely ignoring and abandoning to their fate. The poor, the lame, the blind, the crippled, widows, orphans. In that time period, all these people, it was expected to find them alone and abandoned on the street. This is what they did. Nobody would have blinked an eye to see this. That was their station. And yet this man invited all of them to sit at the same table with him, with all the other rich people who wanted to come, if they wanted to come, with all those people who are well-to-do, with anybody else from outside the city. Everybody sat at the same table and were completely equal. And everybody came, and there was still room left at the table because those people had not been uninvited. They were more than welcome to always come back no matter what. Everyone was invited, everyone was allowed, everyone was accepted from all different walks of life, from completely opposite points of view. All were treated with dignity, with respect, and care. In our first lesson today from Galatians, it pretty clearly describes this in a different way, and it tells us, what to do and why. It specifically calls us to bear each other's burdens. In the very first verse, it uses that word gentleness, and it calls us to bear those burdens, even though we have our own burdens to bear. We all have our own burdens to bear, but we are still called to help bear others' burdens as well. It calls us to work for the good of all, especially those in the family of faith, for the good of all. It's easy to work for the good of those in the family of faith. That's us here. That's this congregation. And I can tell you, I wouldn't blink an eye. I have zero problems with it, and I would not hesitate in helping to bear the burdens of Pastor Kirsty or Angie or Bob and Carol, or Miranda. They're my friends. You all are my friends. You are my family, and I'm confident that they would say the same thing about me. This church, First United Methodist Church, does this really, really well. Because when I was at my lowest, I found myself immediately drawn back to this church. I found myself throwing myself back into this church, into everything that I could here at church, because I knew that this is where I would find life again. I knew that this place, First United Methodist Church, and its congregation would show me gentleness. But one friendly, good-looking guy is just one thing. What about when people are angry at us? What about when people blindly throw labels and generalizations on us and refuse to listen when we try to explain? What happens when we come across somebody who's struggling and we know without a shadow of a doubt that they would mock us, that they would sneer at us and go out of their way to make sure that we knew just how much they despised us and how much they wanted to keep away from us? Wouldn't it just be easier to not even bother at that point? But this first lesson goes on to tell us that just because some of us are part of this family and others aren't, and they may even boast about that fact, we cannot compartmentalize our gentleness to just those who agree with us. Paul tells us in this lesson that this division is so easy to stick with, the division of who's right and who's wrong, who's in and who's out, who's a member, who isn't. But it's not anything anymore. It's not worth the breath to complain about. There's a new creation, and this new creation is everything. And what is this new creation? It's a place where we all work together in gentleness to carry each other's burdens for the good of all. For the good of all. And would it surprise you to find another story in the Bible that kind of pretty well depicts this? Let's take a look. It's a story that most of us are probably familiar with, the story of the Good Samaritan. But there's a lot of history and culture involved here that gives a brand new depth to this. So back then, Israel and Samaria were essentially two different countries. The idea of countries as we know them today didn't really exist back then, but we can view them in that way. But where Israel was going up and down along the ocean there, Samaria kind of jumped right in the middle, and their country bisected Israel into two pieces. So you had Galilee up at the top, where Jesus was from. Then you had Samaria filling in this entire middle gap from the ocean all the way to the Jordan River. And then you had Jerusalem underneath, where the center of everything Israel was. Now, the Samaritans and the Israelites did not get along at all. They were constantly at each other's throats all the time, and generally despised each other, because even though they said they worshiped the same God, they had slightly different centers of worship, and they had slightly different worship traditions. And so they constantly hated each other and constantly avoided each other, to the point that Israelites were even known to, when traveling from north to south, add several days to their journey just so they could walk around Samaria rather than through it. That was how much they hated each other. They did not want to be within miles of each other. You can kind of imagine it in the modern world like a system. Let's say there's two major groups of people who are living in kind of the same land area, who follow the same basic principles of life, but do so from different, let's say platforms. How about that? These Samaritans and Israelites were so opposed to each other. Now, in this story, the Israelite man is robbed, beaten, and left on the side of the road for dead. Now, later in this story, a Samaritan man comes along and sees this beaten Israelite on the side of the road. And in today's world, there's a pretty decent chance that the average person would start taking photos, they'd pop out their phone and take a video, post it online on social media, and say things along the lines of, yeah, it serves them right, or obviously they shouldn't have been doing whatever it is to make the other guy angry. That vitriol we see today is the vitriol that existed between the Israelites and the Samaritans. But this type of behavior doesn't happen in this story. Instead, this Samaritan man immediately stops what he is doing, and he delays his journey, not to avoid the Israelite, but to handle him with care. He puts this man on his donkey, and he takes him to a nearby inn. He tells the innkeeper to do everything he needs to care for this man. The Samaritan pays the innkeeper in advance, and then tells the innkeeper, when I come back through town, just let me know whatever other expenses you had, and I'll pay that too. This Samaritan, knowing that he did not stand well in the eyes of the Israelite, subjected himself to the pain of that robbed man. He helped carry that man's burden. He handled him with care, and he did not leave to his own business until he knew for sure that this Israelite was in a safe place. With gentleness, we are called to lift others up when they are low, even when we don't know them very well, even when we may be so different from them that we would normally never interact with them, even when we don't understand the extent of their pain or even what to do. We are still called to go. In the short time that I've been here, I've gotten to know many of you, and I hold all of you in my heart as friends and family. And many of you also knew my late wife, Amy, who tragically and unexpectedly passed away at the beginning of February. Within 30 minutes of my discovery, Pastor Katie and Tyler were there at my house. Pastor Katie stood with me in the cold and refused to leave until she was absolutely sure of where I was going, who I was going with. She had made sure that my dogs were taken care of, and she even packed me a bag. And when I finally had the barest thread of strength in my body again, several days later, I went back to the house. But I did not go back to that house alone. Pastor Kirsty and Steve and Pastor Katie and Tyler went back with me. We stood in the driveway together, held hands, and prayed together. Then Pastor Katie and Tyler entered the house first to turn on the lights and make sure everything was ready to go. Then Pastor Kirsty and Steve stood next to me, on either side of me, and held my arms. And they walked with me to the door. They held my arms as we walked through the door back into the house. The 5 of us toured my home and brought laughter back into the house. And after the tour, we finished on the back patio where I had found my wife's body. And there they stood with me and prayed with me as I recounted how I had found my wife. They stood there and prayed there with me, where I had been completely alone and isolated as I experienced the worst moment of my entire life. They used their prayers, their presence, their service, their gifts, and their witness to reframe my pain. To ensure that I didn't carry the pain alone, they subjected themselves to my pain to help carry me and to help lift me out of the dirt. They treated me with a soft and a tender touch. They treated me with grace and mercy. They handled me with care. That's why I'm here today. That, church, is the Gentleness Effect.